let's get right to session one. Our first panel will address three core concerns facing the country. Number one, jobs. Number two, poverty, i.e. that frequent result of not having a job. And number three, the safety net, the collection of institutions that, in principle, ensures one against the vagaries of the labor market and prevents poverty. To jumpstart our conversation, we turn to Michael Hout, professor of sociology and director of the Center for Advanced Social Science Research at New York University. Professor Hout is an expert on inequality writ large, and specifically on the effects of the Great Recession on employment trends. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. And of course, he leads the Center's research group on labor markets. Michael Hout.
Thank you very much, Charles. It's really an honor to get asked to speak first. But of course, the reason is that fighting poverty and inequality begins with jobs, and it's really important to keep the focus on jobs, even when we see headlines like this, which many of you have probably seen. Unemployment's at an all-time low. So what's the big deal? We're done. Not so. Partly because the traditional unemployment rate leaves things out, gives us an incomplete picture, and partly because the overall national average is not indicative of the experience of some subpopulations within the whole U.S. population. So I'm here to talk about some of those things today. First and foremost, to note that full recovery has eluded African American men. They started out before the Great Recession, behind the rest of the population in employment, and experienced a deeper drop during the Great Recession, a drop in employment during the Great Recession, and have recovered much more slowly than others. Other groups have had a bit of that experience too. Less educated Hispanic and white men also have had those experiences of starting out behind, dipping deeper, and recovering more slowly. But even if the disparities weren't as great and weren't as important, it's also important to continue focusing on employment when the unemployment rate is low, in part because, as we demonstrated in the 1980s, every job loss makes two people who are still at work nervous. And so with an unemployment rate of 4.5%, about 9% of American workers today are worried that they are likely to lose their job in the next 12 months. One person gets laid off, and two others start to feel the psychological impact of that insecurity. And those insecurities are not equally distributed. African American and Hispanics workers are twice as likely, a little more than twice as likely than white workers to feel that insecurity. So, what's wrong with the unemployment rate? I'm going to skip from focusing on it now to use something else called the prime age employment ratio. It's important to note that when the Center for Poverty and Inequality got kicked off 10 years ago, people did not routinely use this data, this indicator of employment, and now it's routinely presented. It's highlighted in the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports. They always calculated it, but they have not highlighted it. You'll read it in columns in the Wall Street Journal and so on, and it traces, I think, to the emphasis that we've been placing on it. And what is it? It's the ratio of employed persons to the whole population, and then we further restrict that. The prime age part means we're looking at people 25 to 54, who should be mostly, our graduate assistants excluded, outside their schooling, all wrapped up on their schooling, and not yet facing retirement. It's preferred to the traditional measure, first of all, because it gives us a much better view of women's employment experiences over the long haul and for much of the 20th century. And furthermore, it draws attention to discouraged and disabled workers, who are going to be an extremely important part of the story before I wrap up here today. So this is a data chart that you see reproduced in the State of the Union book. The key point to note in it is that the Great Recession hit all of these groups except for the white women. All the other groups were substantially hit by it. Men of all racial and ethnic groups more than women of all the ethnic groups, but everybody shows at least a little bit of a bump down. White women, it's a bit more of a long secular downturn. You might not know this. The month of greatest female employment in U.S. history was January of 2001, the last month of the Bill Clinton administration. Since then, I don't mean to ascribe anything political to it, but it's been headed down since then. No group except for African American women, and them just barely, and in the most recent data, have recovered to the pre-recession employment level. So here's the pre-recession employment level, and here is the post-recession 4.5 unemployment rate employment level for all of these groups, and only for the black women are they back up to that level, and only just now. And what that's telling us is that this is a more sensitive indicator of people's experiences. There are still a lot of discouraged and increasingly disabled people who are out there in the population, but because they're not in the labor force, they're not included in the unemployment rate. This highlights the racial and ethnic disparities and shows dramatically how it was African Americans who experienced the recession more than did members of other groups. The blue lines, you can barely tell the color difference here, but the blue lines are for the African Americans. The difference between whites and African Americans, it went up for the men, went up from 10% to 15%. Among the women, from virtually 0 to almost 5%. So that, whereas the difference between whites and Hispanics did not increase, everybody went down in parallel. But for African Americans, the recession hit harder. When we break this out, and I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but when we break this out by education, we find that high school graduate or lower white and Hispanic men also have this experience of basically a sharper experience with the recession than did the rest of the population. So, as I have said, part of the problem of this traditional unemployment rate is that it leaves people out. It leaves people who are not in the labor force out of the calculation, and thus we lose track of them. So who are missing? In particular, the people who are missing are the, is that right? Yeah. Lost my place in my notes, sorry. Are people who are, I earlier described as discouraged and disabled. There's another excluded group that I failed to mention in the first remark, and those are the currently incarcerated and those who have had a recent incarceration experience and are now out looking for work, but highly discouraged. This is a chart I borrowed from a recent publication, and it shows quite clearly that, importantly, that the people of all these age groups were equally affected by recent recession, so that this is the change from before to after the recession, and throughout the prime employment ages, all of these ages are affected. And this is drawing attention to the fact that it's not people in school, it's not people who are retiring early, it is really a widespread and a broad phenomenon. And I just want to conclude by drawing attention to a book that was published 20 years ago. In 1996, Bill Wilson wrote a book called When Work Disappears, where he described the problems of the inner city, the problems of inner city America. And they were that jobs disappeared, and then social issues of the sort that we now see spreading to suburbs and the rural areas were visited upon those specific inner city areas. And what has happened since then has been that work has disappeared elsewhere. Work has disappeared for suburban workers, work has disappeared for rural workers, and we're seeing exactly those problems of incarceration and addiction that were restricted to and segregated to the central cities at those times have spread outward. And so what was called at the time an idleness problem has in fact spread throughout the rest of the country. Wilson was pushing back against that, saying it's not idleness, it's lack of opportunity. And that is my conclusion from analyzing the specifics of these data about the rest of the country as well. The problems of the inner city are now all of our problems, and jobs are central, A, to precipitating those problems, and the recovery of those jobs are essential to bringing us back to full inclusion of all individuals within our society. That's the end of mine.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, we need this. Our next speaker is Linda Burton. Linda Burton is Dean of the Social Sciences at Duke University and leader of the Poverty Research Group at the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality. An ethnographer who integrates quantitative demographic and geographic analysis in her research, Professor Burton is an expert on intergenerational family structures, rural poverty, and childhood development, and on how these structures and processes are shaped by race, ethnicity, and place throughout the United States. She is the recipient of numerous awards from the American Sociological Association, the Sociological Research Association, and the National Science Foundation. Welcome, Linda Burton.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, I'm so glad you're alive and vibrant here to hear this very, very important message I have to share with you. It is indeed a pleasure to be here today, to see old friends and to meet new ones. It's like coming home for me. Several decades ago, I have to say now, my kids and I had the opportunity to spend a year at this Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences here at Stanford. And they thought it was the best year of their entire life, even better than Christmas. And my youngest daughter, who is sitting in the audience, always said to me, I'm going to get back there someday. And she has come back. She has come back as an assistant professor of cardiothoracic surgery here at Stanford. And I'm very, very proud of her. And very, very proud of the efforts that Stanford has done with respect to issues of diversity, specifically through Dr. Wu and Dr. Ogden, who I thank for giving her a chance. Having said that, our family is no stranger to issues of poverty. We hail from Compton, California, grew up in poverty, and my children did research with me for 30 years in studying families in rural and urban environments. So are quite acquainted with the issues at hand. So moving on, our team's charge was to address poverty, issues that are near and dear to all four of our hearts. We began with the question of what does the general public know about the poor, especially because they haven't been on the radar for quite some time in our nation. So we asked the question, who are the American poor? Now, the popular discourse would lead us to believe that many believe that when we talk about the poor, we're talking about African Americans in urban ghettos, Hispanic immigrants parceled into Latino and Chicano enclaves across rural and urban locales, Native Americans in geographically isolated reservations, and whites with long-standing intergenerational ties to Appalachia uh, in and of itself. Is this popular discourse correct? By melding race, ethnicity, and place, are we on the mark with these particular issues? So those are the issues that we plan to address. As you see in this map, it's a spatial representation of where poverty exists in the nation. The darker shadings indicate the higher poverty levels. In our report, we take a closer look at poverty by race and place and ask whether these commonly reported profiles of the poor mask different types of spatial variation within specific racial and ethnic groups. Throughout our analysis, we focus on household heads aged 25 and over. Our data are from the decennial census, 1980, 1990, 2000, the American Community Survey, 2010, 2015, and the Current Population Survey annual data, 2007 to 2015. So let's focus on this issue of race first. Looking back over the past 35 years, we see dramatic differences by race and ethnicity in the risk of poverty. The broad brush story is of two Americas, with Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans experiencing the high poverty America, and Asian and whites experiencing the relatively low poverty America. This portrait holds in rough form over the entire time series that we studied. Although Hispanics had somewhat lower rates than Blacks and Native Americans in 1980, the gap closed during the Great Recession. In the most recent data from 2015, 1 in 4 Blacks and Native Americans and 1 in 5 Hispanics was poor. This contrasts with 1 in 10 whites and Asians. Although the poverty rate for whites is low, they make up 51% of this nation's poor because there are more whites in the total population. In comparison, Blacks and Hispanics, who comprise 25% of all household heads, account for 44% of our nation's poor. So now let's take a quick look at place. How is poverty arrayed spatially? Cities have the highest poverty rates, followed by rural areas, which have somewhat lower rates, and suburban areas, which have the lowest rates. I see I'm running out of time quickly, so I won't read you all of the details with respect to this. One of the most important takeaways we'd like you to think about with respect to looking at these issues, and as you can see, the rural poverty rates are higher for Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans in rural areas, is that 41% of those who live in rural areas are poor. So while the inner city often provides stereotypical images of poverty in the U.S. as related to city dwellings, we in fact find very high rates of poverty in rural area, and they're parceled out with respect to race. One of the things that I do want to just quickly say with respect to that is that as an ethnographer, and we can talk about this in the discussion period, ethnographically, we do know that rural whites actually experience a tremendous amount of poverty in these environments. And one of the things we need to be paying attention to is especially with the situation with men and health and issues of disability. So it looks like I need to finish up really quickly. What our data has shown us is that we essentially have a new rural order, so to speak, that is compromised by all these wonderful characteristics that I laid out for you. But what is most important that we want to underscore for you is that the South figures very, very prominently in this situation. So finishing up, our two key points, takeaway points, is that there's a high poverty America for Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans. That means we have these two poverty Americas, and a relatively low poverty America for whites and Asians. The usual stereotypes about the melding of race and ethnicity and place are often off the mark. There's high poverty rates in rural southern enclaves, especially for Black women. We see it at a rate of 41%. New Hispanic immigrants face high poverty in rural new destinations. Reservation poverty is also highly persistent. But our question is, when will the South rise again, and how will the South rise? Will it be relative to continued increases in poverty rates? Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Mark Duggan is Wayne and Jody Cooperman Professor of Economics and the Treon Director of the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. And he is also our host here today. So thank you, Mark, and everyone at CBER. Mark was a senior economist on the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 2009 to 2010 and is an expert on health and the effects of large-scale safety net programs such as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid on social and economic outcomes. Mark Duggan.
Thanks, Charles, for the intro. It's a huge honor to be here with everyone today, with all of you today, to talk about this really important set of issues. I'm going to go through, we don't have a ton of time, I understand, so I'm going to try to hit on a bit what my co-author, Valerie Schemata, and I wrote about in our article. Val is a student here at Stanford and has been enormously helpful. And I got an email from her that she's under the weather, but I think, is she here somewhere in the, where? Okay, there she is. Okay, good. You're feeling okay. Okay, great. So good to see Val here. But so we are today, for our assignment, we were asked to sort of look at the safety net in the U.S. and get a sense of how the safety net usage and benefits vary across groups. That's a tall order for me to do in 8 minutes, so I'm just going to try to hit some of the high points. So just first to give you a brief background on federal safety net programs in the U.S. So essentially there are many programs that provide cash or in-kind benefits to those with low income and assets in the U.S. Basically, millions of our nation's most vulnerable residents. We focused in our study on the three largest in terms of expenditures. Medicaid, which provides health insurance to low-income individuals, and it is administered by state governments. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance program, SNAP, food stamps, which is, as you'll see, is a large and important program. And finally, Supplemental Security Income, which provides cash benefits to low-income, elderly, blind, and disabled individuals. We could have looked also at Social Security and Medicare, but we decided to focus on these means-tested programs. Essentially, anyone, Social Security and Medicare provide benefits to people across the income spectrum. So we wanted to zoom in on programs that target those in poverty. And if you look in the U.S. at the very poorest places, these three programs loom very large in people's lives. Enrollment rates are higher. They make a big difference potentially in some people's lives, but there are certainly disparities with respect to their uptake in different areas and the quality of the programs in different areas. Enrollment in all three of them has increased quite a bit, let's say, over the last decade. And another program that has grown over time is the Earned Income Tax Credit, which I'm not going to talk about today, but it is also an important part of the safety net. These three, if I were covering this 25 years ago, I would focus much more on TANF, which previously was known as AFDC, but that program has shrunk quite dramatically over time so that it is tiny relative to these three programs that I'm going to talk about. So just to give you a sense of some numbers on the big programs, the big safety net programs in the U.S., you can get a sense of Medicaid basically is the largest by far in terms of expenditures. And that should be total spending as opposed to federal spending, because Medicaid is funded both by the federal government and state government, about $550 billion a year, and about 72 million recipients. So on average, about $7,500 per year in health insurance. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. SNAP food stamps at about 70 billion with 46 million recipients, and SSI at 66 billion with 8.3 million recipients. So the SSI benefits are about comparable in terms of dollars to food stamps, but much smaller in terms of enrollment. They deliver a larger amount of money per person to recipients than food stamps do. EITC, as you can see, is there. Housing assistance, TANF at just 17 billion. Child nutrition, this would be school breakfast and school lunch programs primarily, and the WIC program. And there's quite significant variation in enrollment in these programs by race and ethnicity. Partly you would expect that, given that poverty rates vary so significantly by race and ethnicity. Poverty rates are higher among Blacks, among Hispanics, and among American Indians. But unfortunately, in terms of getting like perfect data on this, the administrative data on safety net programs generally does not include race and ethnicity. So the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services has no reason to collect collect information on a person's race and ethnicity, and so they do not typically collect this program, at least on a systematic basis. So an alternative source, the one that we used for our study, was the annual March Current Population Survey, which has individual level data on program participation, family income, race, and ethnicity. A limitation of this data that we're using is that it's self-reported. Individuals are known to underreport their participation in government programs generally, but we checked for these three programs, and the self-reported enrollment rates were only about 10% south of where they ought to be, given what we can see from the administrative data. So we feel pretty good that this data, with the caveat that it is self-reported and there are potentially limitations with that, we think that to the extent we could reconcile it, it looks pretty reasonable. Just quick background on Medicaid: 72 million people on the program, administered by states and partially funded by the federal government. One important thing about Medicaid that's not broadly known is that there's a much larger federal match in poorer states than in wealthier states. So a state like West Virginia or Mississippi is going to get a higher share of its Medicaid spending covered by the federal government than a state like Connecticut or New Jersey. More than 2 in 3 people who are enrolled in Medicaid are in private managed care plans, where basically the state government cuts a check to a health insurance company that then coordinates and finances the care. And there's actually not been a ton of research about the consequences of that for Medicaid recipients. But for the remaining 1 in 3, Medicaid directly reimburses hospitals, physicians, pharmacies, and so forth. There's been quite significant recent growth in enrollment driven by the Affordable Care Act. So, this little thing that was passed in March of 2010 that I worked on a little bit, it was it's complicated piece of legislation. It's had a big effect on enrollment in the program, although there's been huge heterogeneity across states with respect to that effect. So just to give you a sense, here in California, 32% state residents are currently enrolled in Medicaid, whereas in Texas, only 18% of state residents are enrolled in Medicaid, despite being a slightly lower income place. And that's to a large extent because Texas did not elect to expand Medicaid as a result of after the Affordable Care Act, whereas California did. And those decisions at the state level, the fact that 19 states decided not to expand Medicaid, had affected some groups more than others. So what we did in our survey, and I'm not going to be able to go through all of these numbers here, but what we tried to do was get a sense of to what extent enrollment in these programs lined up with poverty rates for the program. You can think of, for every N poor individuals in a group, suppose there might be some constant multiple of that on the program. And one of the things that we were struck by, so here we see the poverty rate, and we can see, and this is consistent with the earlier presentation, this is American Indian and Alaska Native here, but Black, Hispanic, and American Indian have higher poverty rates than, let's say, white or Asian. And as one would expect, they also have higher rates of enrollment in the Medicaid program. So 33% of Hispanic individuals in the CPS report that they're enrolled in Medicaid, 31% of Black, 33% of Native American. However, if you take the ratio of that fraction enrolled in Medicaid to the share of the population in poverty, you see some quite significant differences. So more specifically, both Blacks and American Indians have much lower Medicaid enrollment than you'd kind of expect if they had the same ratio as, let's say, whites or other groups. So you can see here that the ratio for blacks is 1.28, for American Indians and Alaska Natives is 1.22, but overall it's almost 1.5. For Asians, it's higher. For Hispanics, it's actually somewhat higher, and for whites, higher too. So there are quite significant differences across groups, and a big driver of that is the fact that certain, especially for blacks, is that some states expanded Medicaid, whereas others did not. So if you look in places where the proportion of the population that is black is relatively high, those states tended not to expand Medicaid. And so that is part of the reason that we have a big difference, a much lower enrollment in Medicaid than perhaps one would expect. For the other safety net programs, things are somewhat more comparable. So for food stamps, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, $70 billion a year in federal spending. About 1 in 5 kids are currently getting benefits from food stamps. And it is another in-kind as opposed to cash safety net program. The average household gets about $255 per month, and per person it's about $126 each month. And you can think about that. So how much is that? That's about $1.40 per meal in the course of, that's one way to think about the average food stamp benefit. This program has grown a lot over the last 10 years. If you looked at enrollment in the program 10 years ago, 2007, it was more like 26 or 27 million. And it went up a lot during the Great Recession, and it has remained fairly high. Partly that was a function of federal policies that increased slightly the generosity of the program. But here you can see for this program, the share enrolled in SNAP benefits, receiving food stamp benefits, also is higher among disadvantaged groups, but among certain minority groups. But this here you see that the ratios here, so overall it's about 0.95 ratio, which is to say for every 100 people who are in poverty, we've got about 95 people who are on food stamps. And the ratios here across groups are more comparable than previously. For Hispanics, very close to that. For blacks, actually slightly higher than that. And for American Indians, slightly higher than that. The final program that we zoomed in on was Supplemental Security Income. So this program provides benefits to people, low-income individuals who are aged, blind, or disabled. The growth in this program over the years has been in the number of people getting benefits because of disability. In 2015, there were about 8.3 million beneficiaries receiving $55 billion in benefits. The maximum monthly payment for a person on SSI is $735. So in contrast to food stamps, which provides smaller benefits per month to a larger number of people, SSI concentrates more money per month to a smaller number of people, to people who are disabled. But it's a program that's grown enormously in terms of, when we think about the safety net. If we look back 25 years ago, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, AFDC, was massively bigger than SSI, and now the reverse is true. So there's really been a shift. And so what we see, but there are, of course, differences in rates of disability across groups. So for example, Hispanics have lower rates of disability, partly because their average age is younger. But what we uncovered here is that, if you basically look at the share enrolled in SSI, it actually is highest for Black and American Indians, which kind of makes sense given their higher poverty rates. The group for whom it is lowest are Hispanics. Now, partly that may reflect the fact that Hispanics are younger on average and so less likely to be disabled, but it could also be evidence of language barriers or other things, because it's a somewhat complicated program to apply for and to navigate and to go through that whole process. So I think just to summarize, safety net program enrollment certainly does vary by race and ethnicity. Enrollment is generally higher among Blacks, American Indians, and Hispanics than among whites and Asians, which one would expect given the higher poverty rates. The thing that jumped out at us the most was the difference for Medicaid, and that is partly a consequence of the state Medicaid expansion decisions. But I think it's important for people who are interested in the effect of these programs, which kind of cushion the economic disadvantage that millions of our fellow residents face, fellow U.S. residents face, that what are the other factors that lead to program enrollment varying for reasons that aren't ideal? Take-up decisions, for example, do people know about these programs? Language barriers, are people geographically isolated? What about program quality? How good is the program? Perhaps the reason that some don't sign up for Medicaid is that maybe the program isn't as good for them. So in any case, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Mark. And if you could stay up, and if Linda and Mike could come back up to the table, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and someone will bring you a handheld microphone. And before you ask your question, if you could please just tell us your name and where you're from.
Ben Stetson, Sunnyvale. I'm personally coming to the conclusion that at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a shift from agricultural work to industrial work, labor force. I think employment rates will continue to be very depressing because I think we're on the cusp of another huge change, and that is automation. Not everyone will need to work in order to make everything we not only need, but everything we want. I don't think the politicians are talking about it because to me it's just mean to bring up a problem and then not discuss a possible solution. One possibility I've heard of is universal, unconditional income. Do any of you have any thoughts on that? Thank you.
I can take a stab, or do you want to? Yeah. I'll take a stab too. Or yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll both take a stab on this. Are we on here? Okay.
We're on.
So there are two premises to your point. One is that work will disappear not because of consumption disappearing, but because we'll be able to make stuff without people. And without people, when we make stuff without people, then the jobs disappear. I remember reading that when I was in college, and that was a long time ago. But the idea, the solution you're talking about of a guaranteed annual income is actually a really good idea for a number of other reasons, even if the technological promise is not for leisure for all. I believe that there are other reasons to support that. And in 1996, a group of colleagues and I wrote a book called Inequality by Design, where that was one of the things we talked about, guaranteed annual income. The earned income tax credit addresses that in some ways, but the earned income part of it means that you have to have a job in order to qualify for it. Generalizing it to people who aren't is not a politically popular idea, but may in fact be something that has to be addressed.
Sure. Do you want to weigh in? I'm happy to. Yeah. Okay. So let me take a stab. I think we have had some recent experience in the U.S. with pretty massive disruptions to the labor market. I've been quite influenced by research looking at the effects of rapidly expanding trade with China on certain industries, and that has really hit. And trade has the potential to provide huge benefits to consumers, lower prices, more product quality, and so forth. And economists generally love trade because it leads to more efficiency and so forth. But there have been some pretty big disruptions over the last 15, 20 years to the U.S. labor market coming from trade, and I think that the safety net in the U.S. did not really step up and address the challenges that were created by that. So a lot of people were displaced, and there was not, and there are these programs like trade adjustment assistance and so forth that just didn't do an adequate job to help people get back in the game, figure out ways to. I think the phrase that is often used is sort of universal basic income. The devil is in the details on moving to something like that. We have a lot of programs. We've got food stamps, we've got supplemental security income, we've got Medicaid, we've got all these different things. And so if you move to a sort of, let's give $1 benefit to everyone, then as they earn money, that dollar benefit phases out, so that if you earn enough, then you get nothing from the program. It's really complicated to figure out, and there will be winners and losers from that. I think that there are perhaps other. It's hard to predict what we're on the cusp of. I mean, I do think automation is there could be very significant changes, but I think there are. barring going to a full-scale universal basic income, there are incremental changes that we could make to our safety net that would make it more responsive to rapid changes in the labor market that would help people and also help the labor market. We saw I think quite striking figures about employment rates declining over time in the U.S., which we're kind of an outlier among our industrialized counterparts. Employment rates have been going up among prime age, both men and women. So in any case, it's a hard question, I think, but I'm worried about what we're on the cusp of too. But I think the recent experience of trade with China is not so different from what we may be about to experience.
Linda?
I'd like to add something to your question, which I really liked. And my addition really has to do with your timeline. You went from agriculture to industrialization, but there's another step in there that is the low-wage service sector. And the reason why I want to bring this part to bear is because of the implications it has had for employment for women, especially women in rural communities. I mentioned briefly in my comments that men in some of these rural communities are in extremely poor health. A lot of them with disabilities and the like. And who do you think is holding it down for these households? It's women. And women having to go to work in these low-wage labor jobs, working at Sheetz, Walmart, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to make sure we added that time slot into your trajectory.
Back.
Thank you. My name is Sonu Thadani, and I work for Stanford Medicine. I also serve as on the San Mateo County Commission for Juvenile Delinquency and Prevention. And my question has to do with the role of artificial intelligence, mostly algorithms that are used, for instance, in employment. There are a whole host of people who apply for specific jobs. Before anyone even interviews them, systems decide who's going to get interviewed and people get eliminated. And the potential racial bias that exists in algorithms that are based on data that might be racially biased, as we can see, for instance, the criminal justice system. I'd be curious to hear your comments on that.
Well, again, as I said at the beginning, jobs are the main way, are the first step in fighting poverty and inequality. And if the tools we use to select people among many applicants for a job are systematically excluding people, I think that, first of all, the courts are a legitimate way of addressing these when you've got evidence that that is working. I think that for most employers, actually, the referral networks are as important as the algorithms. The Silicon Valley is always way ahead, and may in fact be pushing this. What I think is going on in most of the country, though, is a way in which individuals who don't have friends who are already employed are not hearing about job opportunities because things are handled in an informal way. The research, mostly qualitative, has shown again and again that the information doesn't circulate. I'm thinking especially of Sandra Smith's work in African American communities as it does elsewhere. And so I think that that's an important part. You're pointing out a really important thing that is, I think, not on researchers' agendas, but somebody's going to get on that soon.
And I do think even before AI was doing this, there were quite significant biases in the sort of recruiting type processes. So I've been I know of multiple studies, audit studies, that have compared callback rates for identical resumes with names that sound, that basically give you a sense that the person is white or African American or Hispanic, and the callback rates for the identical resume are very different across groups. There was no AI. This was individuals, and I think, but we know much less about what is driving that. And I think that, perhaps AI, if we move to AI, maybe it will be more transparent. We can figure out ways to more transparently correct any baked in biases to the process. But this has been, I don't know that AI will make it work. I think it's been a problem for a long time, and AI maybe has the potential to do better and reduce biases as opposed to amplify biases that were already there. But you seem skeptical of that. What's that? Sorry?
Start with 30 data.
Yeah, right, right, okay.
Yes, I'd like to just add another component to it since you moved toward artificial intelligence, and to say that there's also another angle that's important within the natural sciences to think about, which is related to the idea of social capital. One of the things that we've been understanding in the work that we do with families is that families or individuals in families have to be able to have the skill set and the readiness to be able to engage in social capital opportunities and to identify them when they come along, despite the other kinds of barriers that may prohibit them from doing that, like being locked into families who are not attached to people who can help you to get a job. The relationship we see there is related to lifetime trauma, that is trauma that individuals have experienced since childhood, and how their brains, and it's linked to neuroscience, not how the brain changes its structure, but how the brain actually connects and sends off certain connections to make one be in a situation where they're open to actually engage in behaviors that lead to social capital. So one of the things that our data show is that people who have experienced a lifetime of trauma, when you do MRIs in their brain and you ask them questions that are related to how they would proceed in moving toward being open to relationships, like ones that would lead to social capital, the side of their brain that lights up with respect to that is not the side that should. It's the side that talks about morality. It's the side that talks about a fear of engaging with other people. It's a side that is connected to issues of uncertainty. So trauma is part of the equation as it relates to social capital and all the algorithms of artificial intelligence that you were talking about as well.
Hi, I'm Mary Jo Cook, and I run a nonprofit that works with small businesses and focuses on job creation. But we've done a lot of work around what is a quality job, and I'd like to build on your comment around the service sector growth, and what do you see in terms of either measuring or looking at not just unemployment rate, but the rate of jobs that can actually let workers gain skills, gain wealth, grow up a career ladder, and ultimately jobs that can support families, right? So the unemployment rate may be down, but most of the jobs created would not get you off public assistance. So how are we dealing with that?
Yeah, the two ways that we try and make work pay are oblique at best in the way they relate to these outcomes. First of all, the Earned Income Tax Credit does a little bit of supplementing the paycheck and is geared for parents to get people above get their families above the poverty line, but you have to be a parent to get the full benefit of EITC. So we could open that up to non-parents and fight the poverty among single persons in that way. But I don't think anyone has mastered the way in which we can come upon a solution to the type of employment that we had when people belonged to unions and unions fought for higher pay for people who weren't in the boardroom. And until we come up with an alternative to replace the role that unions once occupied, I don't know how how we're going to address that one. I don't think it's a general policy issue. I think it's a social organization issue.
I think, I mean, do you want to come next? Okay, so I think there are some jobs where the growth within that sort of position may be limited, where the upside growth may be limited. But I think my hope and understanding is that for many people, they can require additional education through community colleges and other forms of higher ed. I worry a lot about what is happening right now in higher ed. Not so much at, you know, Stanford's doing well. We could always be doing better, but I worry at places like community colleges, state universities. The funding is declining, and I think it's becoming harder for people to access those opportunities to build their skills while they're simultaneously working. Like so many people who are attending community colleges and state universities and public universities are they're simultaneously working, and to the extent that those are becoming more expensive or the number of slots is falling, I worry a lot about that. So it's hard, I think, for policy to change the job ladder like within companies. But I think helping people to build their skills is something that policy can do very well. And I think it is vulnerable right now because of the budgetary pressures that we are seeing across the entire public sector.
I would have to say that with respect to what are good and bad jobs, that definitely good jobs are ones that have the insight to know that work is a family affair. That it's not just about the individual being able to move forward, but also about the individual when they are at work, whatever job they are at, that they're not worried to death about how they're going to provide care for their aging parent or their auntie who's living with them. Or, for example, and with many of the families I study, I think a lot of one of the women in my study in Chicago who worked the night shift, had 5 children, and would come to work as a janitor and leave her kids in the car at night so that they could sleep. Because she didn't have anyone to take care of them. So good jobs are not only about how they allow you to grow intellectually or in your field, but also how they ease the challenges that we experience in today's world with respect to caring for kin. It's not quite as easy as it used to be, or at least the stories that we hear back in the day.
I think on that very good point, we'll have to draw this session to a close. We've got more talks to come, but at this point there will be a quick 10-minute break, and we will reconvene here for our second session at promptly starting at 11:20 a.m. So thank you to our distinguished panelists.